There's been a lot of talk in various forms of media about what the car industry's response is to the various zero emissions mandates that have been going backwards and forwards. And most of the dialogue that you hear on various media platforms is complete nonsense, utter rubbish. And I'll tell you why. The mainstream car industry works on really long time cycles. It used to be 7 years from concept to customer. So you'd think of an idea for a new type of car and it would take you up to 7 years before the first one was in production. And I'll tell you why that's the case in a moment. Then you have a car in production that you might last for what, 7 years for a typical model, with a facelift halfway through to freshen it up a bit, where we change the bumpers and the headlights and things like that to make it look a bit more enticing. So when you design a car, you're thinking, what are people going to be buying in 15 years' time? Can you imagine doing that today? What are people going to buy in 15 years' time? What were people buying 15 years ago? Do you remember 15 years ago? What was happening then? It's a really difficult thing. And this is why car companies tend to be very conservative in what they do, because they've got to play it safe. Now, the reason it takes so long is because you have to do a lot of work. When you're in mass production, the numbers start playing funny games with you. If you're producing a car that you might be making 1 million of them a year, of a particular type of car. And that means if there's a fault, a devastating fault that could happen, but there's a 1 in a million chance of it hurting someone, then if you're making 1 million cars a year, you're definitely going to hurt someone every year. So 1 million to 1 chance of something going wrong is effectively a dead certainty. So you have to test things to the nth degree. You have to make sure anything that could go wrong, you're looking at 1 in 100 million, 1 in 1,000 million chances of something going wrong. And you have to be certain of that, which means you have to do a huge amount of test work. Not only that, when you're producing the car, all the cars have got to be the same. The first car's got to be good as the last car produced off that line. So the tooling is a completely different world. The thing that stamps out the side of a car, that huge piece of tooling's got computers in it, it's got thermocouples, temperature control all over it to stop it warping. So the casting, the panel it makes at the beginning of the day is exactly the same as the panel it makes at the end of the day. All these machine tools that build the vehicles run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There's just 1 week of shutdown in the middle of the year where all the maintenance is done. It's a completely different world. It's nothing like what you might think. And unless you're in the car industry, you just wouldn't understand. So to make sure everything works properly, you've got to test out all that tooling that makes the vehicles, and that can take up to a year. So before you actually start making cars you can sell, you're testing out the tooling and the production process that makes that vehicle. And this is where we get the pre-production cars and the press launch cars. They're all made through that process. Before that, we've got to have finished all our engineering work and make sure everything's done. So we've got a year of testing in hot climates, cold climates, Arctic Circle, deserts, all this sort of thing, crash testing, emission certification, which is really, really difficult. All of that work has to be done, and there's a good year's work of that. So we're now 2 years before you sell the first car. We are testing all our designs. And that means we have to have finished our design before we can test it. So 3 years before it's in production, we're finishing off the design work, all the calibration, engine tuning, all this sort of stuff. And that means all of those features that we are tuning and getting to work properly have to have finished their design. And that we do the year before, etc. And if there's a particularly new type of technology going into there, that can take a couple of years of development as well. So that takes us many years before that first car is produced. A lot of work goes into that. And a typical family car might take 4 billion to develop. It's a really expensive process. So you've invested all that money and all that time before you've sold your first car. And then maybe you'll make your money back in 4 years of production. And then the last 3, 4 years of production, maybe you're making a profit on it. And as soon as that first car goes into production, we on the development team, we're working on the next one. So they're investing that money they're getting in the next model already. So there's this continual cash flow all through the system, and it's hugely dependent on selling enough cars. If your sales drops by 10%, your profit margin's gone. So you've got to predict what people are going to buy with reasonable accuracy all those years in advance and make sure they buy it. The factory that makes these things has got huge pieces of equipment that cost millions of pounds. and they've got to work reliably year after year. So the factory investment is even longer. You're looking at 20, 30, 40-year plans, maybe even 50-year plans for a factory. And that whole factory line, the way it's laid out and the equipment on it is designed to make a platform, a type of vehicle. If you suddenly change to a different type of platform, you've got to rip loads of that out. And that means that factory is going to be stopped for all that time you're ripping it out. And that costs millions just in stoppage time, let alone the investment in new equipment. So when a new model comes out, it uses a lot of engineering features off the old model, but so we can use the tools, adapted, changed, but basically the tools from the previous model. Otherwise, cars would cost a fortune and you would have to pay a lot more money for an ordinary car. So to make the cars cheap enough for you to afford, these machine tools have to be absolutely used to their best advantage and used for as long as possible. So for a platform, you're looking at decades of planning going into that. And that means that when the government changes the rules and they say, okay, we're going to go from combustion car platforms to EVs, for instance, that takes a lot of planning. And I know from my work in the mainstream car industry that car companies have been planning to go full EV for over 20 years. This has always been the plan. That was inevitable. It was just a question of when and how. No car company could go full EV on its own because it would be exposed to all the market stresses there. It would be leading the market. It would take the hit. It would probably suffer. And then the other companies would produce EVs afterwards, after that company's done all the hard work. So we need legislation to change the goalposts so that everyone's working to the same rules. So the car companies have been waiting for the legislation to change in line with what's capable. Now, when a politician or a government or whatever suddenly decides, yeah, we're going to change the date that we're going to zero emission vehicles by 5 years, yeah, the car industry cannot react to that quickly. Those plans were made 20 years ago. All you're doing is messing around with what those car plants can produce. At the end of the day, car companies have got to sell what they are making. So if you're making a load of hybrids today, you are going to be selling a load of hybrids today and telling everybody hybrids are the best thing. If you're making combustion vehicles today, you've got to sell those today. What you'll sell next year might be something completely different. And what we're seeing in the car industry is that this big change to a different platform means they're having to rip up factories or build new factories. And that's a huge investment. And it's taken a long time to build up, make sure they've got it right. Because if they got the wrong type of infrastructure in that factory, that's that car company ruined. So a lot of car companies are now building new factories or refurbishing factories for these new electric platforms. And this is a long-term view. A lot of the EVs that have been on the market now are converted combustion platforms. So if we look at things like the Peugeot Ion, we've done a lot of work with Peugeot Ions recently. That's a Mitsubishi i-MiEV, used to be a Kai car in Japan with a 650cc engine in it. They've changed one floor panel underneath the vehicle to make the battery fit, and the rest of it's a bit of a compromise. So it's heavier than it needs to be because it's got bits in the wrong place. It's not a great piece of packaging. It kind of works. It's a fine car. There's nothing wrong with it, but it could be a lot better if it was designed as an EV in the first place. So a lot of the EVs we're seeing on the market now are compromised in that front because of the way you have to make them using the infrastructure you've already got. Now, the new infrastructure, the new factories that are coming through, we'll start seeing these new full EV platforms from all of the mainstream car manufacturers over the next 5 years. And that's going to be the game changer. That's going to be the direction of travel. And as they come to the end of life of the existing combustion and hybrid platforms, those factories will then be converted over to the new energy systems as and when. But again, car companies have got to hedge their bets a bit because you never know what the governments are going to do. And it's not just the government of one country. If you're selling cars, you're selling them internationally. Here in the UK, we produce more cars now than we have ever done in the past. And 80% of those cars are exported. So you're not just thinking about one country, you're thinking about the global market, the European market, North America, Asia. So we need all of the governments to move at the same rate to make the factory worthwhile investing in. It's totally different from just a cottage industry where you've got a few people nailing bits together on a frame and you can change at a whim to making something completely different. These are long-term plans that take decades. And it can't change on a a whim of a government official. So when you next see an announcement that such and such a mandate has changed by 2 years here or 5 years there, that's just politics. It's got nothing to do with the real world. And when you see a magazine article or whatever saying such and such a car company has stopped producing EVs, yeah, the old compromise platform EV plant has come to the end of its natural 7-year cycle. That stopped. There's now going to be a gap before the new EV platform factory is up and running. There's not enough money to keep things going any longer than that, so there will be a gap. So some EV platforms will stop, there'll be a bit of a gap, then the new EV platforms will come out. That's normal. Some people report that as they've stopped making EVs. That's not the full picture. As everything, the full picture is complicated, and sound bites and clickbait is always simple phrases, and simple little phrases are always misleading and wrong.